What would the United States do if Russia and China joined forces to launch an invasion the likes of which we've never seen before? It's the worst-case scenario for global peace, but it's one that's also not a complete impossibility given how much Russia and China have been cooperating in recent years. Both are members of the powerful BRICS economic group and are using that membership to spread anti-West sentiment among other members. The two countries have increasingly strong economic ties, and if their rhetoric is more than just hollow saber-rattling, we may see them ally more closely on the military level than ever before. That would be bad news for the United States. Combine China's constantly modernizing military with Russia's increasingly battle-hardened forces, and you have an alliance that could spell major problems for the world's most powerful military nation. So what would this hypothetical fight look like? Would the US manage to successfully repel Russia and China if they invaded? Or would we see a new dawn in global geopolitics, with the East now leading the way? Is such a war even possible? According to an October 2023 report by the Strategic Posture Commission, it is, and the United States needs to start preparing for that war now. The report argues that both countries are expanding their conventional forces, with China also going heavy on nuclear strengthening. An anonymous official who worked on the report ultimately concludes that we worry there may be ultimate coordination between them in some way, which gets us to this two-war construct. It's a worrying report. Right now, President Biden claims that at least on the nuclear level, the United States doesn't need to expand beyond what it already has. And he's probably right. According to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, the U.S. has 5,224 nukes in various states of operational capacity, which matches up well with Russia's 5,889. China is well behind, with ICAN stating that Beijing only has 410 warheads, though Pentagon reports suggest that number will be closer to 500 by 2035. Regardless, mutually assured destruction is a strategy that all three countries can rely upon. They each have enough nukes to obliterate the others into dust, so a nuclear deterrent would hopefully stave off a war. But what if those nuclear weapons didn't exist, or defense technology was developed that made them less than the looming threat of mutual Armageddon that they are right now? Then it would come down to a fight between more conventional forces, and that's a fight that the United States may struggle to win. According to Global Firepower, the United States leads the way when it comes to sheer military strength. It has a touch under 1.4 million active military personnel, with another 442,000 in reserve, and it achieves dominance on land and at sea. The U.S. has 484 naval assets, including 11 aircraft carriers and 9 helicopter carriers that can support its stock of 9,975 combat-ready aircraft if they need to leave American soil to take the fight to China or Russia. Those numbers are impressive. The U.S. certainly has the equipment advantage, with China and Russia combining to have 4,307 combat-ready aircraft, less than half that available to the Americans. On the naval front, more on this later, the U.S. actually has fewer naval assets than China, which has 730 ships. However, China focuses predominantly on corvettes and patrol vessels, neither of which are suitable for deep-water combat with America's fleet of 92 destroyers. Russia's naval situation is somewhat similar to China's. It has 598 assets, though it can only count 1 aircraft carrier and a miserly 15 destroyers amongst them. So when it comes to the sheer volume of devastating equipment, the U.S. comes out on top. But we can't say the same for the number of people it has at its disposal. Though Russia's army is smaller than America's, it has 830,900 active members to the 1.4 million the U.S. has. Moscow has larger access to paramilitary forces that number 250,000. China actually has a bigger army than the U.S. thanks to its 2 million active personnel and 625,000 paramilitary members. Combine the two, and you get about 2.83 active fighters, double the number the U.S. has, and a paramilitary force of nearly 900,000. Throw in the reserves, with China and Russia combining to field 760,000 of reserve personnel, and it's clear that a numbers game would not go in America's favor if China and Russia invaded U.S. soil. But an invasion might never get that far. The United States is in the fortunate position of being separated from China and Russia by both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Regardless of which avenue of attack the combined forces might use, they have to overcome thousands of miles of water just to reach the American mainland. And in those waters would be American submarines and destroyers. The U.S. has more vessels in both categories than Russia and China. That would ward off a seaborne invasion. Even the Bering Strait, a 55-mile wide strait separating Alaska from Russia-controlled Siberia, would not likely be an option for the combined forces. The US would immediately identify that potential route into North America and defend it fiercely with a combination of its naval and aerial powers, creating a bottleneck in which it could destroy Russia and China's vessels at will. Speaking of aerial might, neither China nor Russia would be able to display much of theirs. The ocean waters that separate them from the US would mean that fighters and aircraft carrying troops would struggle to make the journey. Even a craft with enough fuel reserves to get to the US would easily be spotted and likely shot out of the sky before they ever made it to American soil. And between them, Russia and China only have 3 aircraft carriers and 3 helicopter carriers, clear targets for the American destroyers and submarines should they ever get within touching distance of the states. Here we see America's first line of defense against an invasion, taking advantage of its geographical position. The Atlantic and the Pacific are huge barriers for China and Russia to overcome. With American ships deployed into those oceans constantly bombarding the ships its foes try to send over, there's little risk of a true land-based fight occurring. Russia and China could potentially be limited to the use of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, to launch attacks on American soil. And if the war ever got to that stage, it would be clear that the nuclear deterrent hadn't worked, leaving the entire world in serious trouble. Speaking of the rest of the world, alliances with other countries would be another cornerstone of America's defense against an invasion. After all, the same oceanic barriers that could keep China and Russia off American soil would also make it difficult for the United States to take the fight to its enemies. That's where America's focus on building cooperative alliances with other countries could pay off. According to Al Jazeera, the United States currently has 750 military bases spread across 80 countries throughout the world. Japan, South Korea, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Germany, the UK, and Australia all play host to some of these bases, giving the US truly global coverage. That coverage would play into America's favor should war with Russia and China ignite. In particular, America's military bases in the Indo-Pacific region would become launching points for assaults on the two countries. Japan and South Korea in particular would get drawn into the conflict, especially as both of those have their own concerns about increasing Chinese aggression and modernization. An invasion against the United States would be a portent of future invasions into those countries, assuming those invasions didn't happen first, and neither would be likely to sit back and allow America to lose. But interestingly, those military bases may not be as effective as the US would hope. In September 2023, Michael Hirsch, the former foreign editor of Newsweek, wrote a piece for Politico magazine that detailed what might happen if China were to invade Taiwan. He posited that China would use a shock and awe approach, destroying Taiwan's naval and aerial forces in a matter of days. Hirsch went on to point out that Biden's promises to defend Taiwan in such an event would spell disastrous consequences for the US. Aware of the American threat, China would get ahead of it by launching the same type of shock and awe campaign on US bases throughout the Indo-Pacific. Hirsch believes these preemptive attacks would leave many American bases in tatters, and though the US might even the playing field for a while, especially once it started deploying submarines, B-21 and B-2 stealth bombers to those bases, Washington would run out of munitions in days rather than months. The carefully curated network of allies would be severed. The US would lose tens of thousands of service members and would then have to try to play catch-up with China's powerful industrial bases. It's an interesting hypothetical that gives insight into how China might launch an attack on the United States. Rather than hitting the mainland, China would take out as many American bases near its territory as it could, reducing the US's ability to hit the Chinese mainland in the process. And this hypothetical isn't a random conjuring from Michael Hirsch's mind. He points out that America has run dozens of these war game scenarios over the last few years, with the most recent being done by the House Select Committee in April 2023. In almost all of them, America's resources run dry in a matter of days. The aircraft it has stationed at its overseas bases are destroyed. The air-to-surface missiles it could launch at China get used up within days, and no more are forthcoming. China takes the Indo-Pacific region, and in doing so, it decimates one of America's most important lines of defense. But here is the scariest part. These wargame scenarios don't include Russia. If Putin were to join forces with Xi and launch this preemptive attack together, the already devastating effects on America's overseas forces would be total. The message from these scenarios is simply that the United States may have stretched itself too thin when trying to cover every global base. While having so many military installments in far-flung countries gives it the ability to control weaker forces, it doesn't mean much against the combined might of China and Russia. Destruction of these bases might not provide either country with a route onto American soil, but it would deplete the United States before it even knew that a war had begun. Still, the US could always rely on NATO. In the wake of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, NATO has only grown stronger. The spirit of cooperation under which the organization was founded is tighter than ever, with its members having been forced into situations that help them see how to work together better in the case of future invasions. Plus, more European countries want to join. Finland became the newest member in April 2023, Sweden, Georgia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and of course Ukraine all want to be a part of the group. That's excellent news for the United States in its hypothetical war with China and Russia. The US could call on NATO to hamper Russia on the European front if an invasion were to occur. It has plenty of leverage too, as America spends 3.49% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, on defense funding. Only Poland spends more in proportion of GDP. And in terms of sheer monetary contributions, the US is well ahead of the pack as the world's largest military spender. Given that the idea of NATO is to try to create a collective defense force, America would be able to enact a "we've scratched your back so it's time for you to scratch ours" scenario to distract Russia. NATO forces could fight Russia on the European mainland, freeing up the US to focus on China's efforts in the Indo-Pacific. It's still not a perfect strategy. Without making sure there's a clear avenue to replenishing its overseas bases should China attack, as well as having the means to anticipate such an attack if it happened, the US would still struggle with Xi's army. But it could at least use NATO to occupy the Russian forces, meaning it doesn't have to face both alone. However, we also can't ignore the fact that Russia and China would have allies too. China in particular has been very clever about how it builds allegiances. Since the launch of its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, China has provided billions of dollars in loans to smaller countries to help them build new infrastructure. The majority of these countries are in Asia and Africa, again allowing the US to enjoy a distance advantage. However, according to the Foreign Affairs Committee, FAC, 7 South American countries have accepted China's money to fund their own projects. Those countries are Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina, Uruguay, Venezuela, and Chile, with the FAC pointing out that China's state-owned operations funded $11.3 billion in BRI projects in South America in 2021. That's a problem for the United States. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, China's BRI contracts have some interesting caveats. One is that the countries that receive funding can't consolidate their loans with members of the Paris Club, such as the United States. Essentially, China has trapped many countries that benefit from BRI into not being able to seek funding from other countries to repay their loans. That creates reliance on China, deepening financial ties, if not militaristic ones. Then there's the sneaky condition that China has to be able to ask for all the money back from its loans at any point. The CFR said that this condition was in many of the more than 100 contracts that a 2021 study analyzed, and it's a worrying one for the US. If China suddenly decides to ask for its money back right now, as it would if it were preparing for an invasion, every one of the South American countries that have benefited from the BRI would be in a tough position. Faced with the prospect of plunging themselves into debt to satisfy their paymasters, it's not outside the realm of possibility that they would offer alternative forms of payment to Beijing, say in the form of letting China set up military bases on their territory. The United States can't allow that to happen because China's enhancement of its military presence in South America provides it with a much clearer route into the United States. America would have to get ahead of this problem to maintain its defensive strategy. If there's any hint of China trying to claim its money back, it would need to offer all 7 of the South American BRI countries a more attractive alternative. Beijing would be angry due to the breaking of the BRI contracts, but splashing more cash than China would at least keep Xi's forces away from the American continent, even if it was an act of provocation that could spark a war. And speaking of money, this brings us to another strategy that the US already uses and will only ramp up should a war break out: spending more than any other nation. As mentioned, the United States is the largest military spender in the world. Statista said that it splashed out $877 billion on defense spending in 2022, more than double the combined $378.4 billion that China and Russia spent. That's always been one of America's biggest advantages. It can spend more, which is why it has better and more equipment than its 2 biggest rivals. But a near trillion-dollar annual outlay may not be enough to beat China and Russia for two reasons. First, though America spends more on its military, its money doesn't stretch as far as China's. For instance, AEI points out that China can pay its soldiers about 16 times less than the US. Russia has a similar advantage too, with Sandbox pointing out that the pay for a Russian junior officer was about $900 a month in February 2022, less than half of the $2,100 paid to an American equivalent. The result is China and Russia's military budgets aren't as far behind America's as they seem. Senator Dan Sullivan, the representative of Arkansas, points this out when he says that Beijing has practically achieved military spending parity with Washington. They, meaning intelligence officials, came out and said the real Chinese budget in terms of military is probably close to about $700 billion, he says. Some of this disparity might come from China's secretive nature, but much of it, and it's the same with Russia too, comes with the fact that these countries simply spend less per person to maintain their forces. America would have to confront this issue, and it wouldn't do it by lowering pay. Rather, it would simply have to commit more. More spending to bring new soldiers into the fold. Even more spending on equipment to ensure it maintains its advantage at sea and in the air. In short, one of America's most important strategies would be to commit even more cash to its military. That would be a difficult prospect today when the country is at peace. However, the prospect of a joint Chinese and Russian invasion would likely lead to approval among the people for greater military spending. The only question would be then, how deep could America's cash reserves run? Of course, more spending may not be the perfect strategy when faced with a foe who can spend just as much as you can. Beijing is a titan in the military spending arena, with Russia teaming up with them, combined with the lower costs of running the joint army, likely leading to the combined countries being able to outspend the US. But the United States would still have another trick up its sleeve: sequencing. According to AEI, sequencing is a strategy that allows a country to manage several volatile problems at once without having to retreat. The idea is that you may have more time to handle a situation in one region than you would in another. By resolving the immediate problem as quickly as possible, you give yourself more time to make preparations in other areas of the conflict. For instance, if Russia and China made overtures of their turning attention to the United States during Putin's war with Ukraine, finishing that war would be a top priority for Washington. It's a drain on America's resources. That, quote, finishing could involve a preemptive strike against Russia, with the US getting involved directly rather than simply sending money and weapons. Or in the worst case, it could involve a withdrawal of funds to Ukraine, potentially sacrificing the smaller territory to take care of itself. Alternatively, it could increase the financial backing of Ukraine, taking resources away from itself to keep Russia occupied while America's forces prepare. Whichever way that conflict went, the US would then need to resolve the fighting between Israel and Hamas. Again, it would face similar options: get involved to end the war, withdraw support, or allow the fighting to continue so that it destabilizes the Middle East to the point where the region becomes a distraction for China. Whatever the choices may be, the goal is simple: buy time. By resolving comparatively smaller issues elsewhere, the US would be able to delay the invasion by occupying Russia and China's forces while trying to bring both countries to the negotiating table. Behind the scenes, it would prepare. American fortifications would become stronger, reserves may be called up. Given the simulated consequences of a Chinese attack on America's Indo-Pacific bases, we might even see the States pull its soldiers back to the country. NATO would be on alert. The time bought would allow for preparations, with the invasion of the United States coming at the end of a sequence that may see the states in Ukraine, Israel, Japan, South Korea, and any other country that poses a threat to Russia or China as buffers. In essence, the United States would be using proxies. Allied proxies, and proxies it may support financially or militarily, but proxies all the same. Whether those smaller countries succeed or fail would be almost irrelevant. The important part is that they would buy time for the US, while slowly bleeding the Russian and Chinese forces by acting as military barriers against them. Maybe it's here where we'd see America's strategy of global cooperation come to fruition. The States could position itself as the one country that absolutely cannot fall, because if it did, the rest of the world might find it impossible to fend off joint Chinese and Russian ambition. America's allies would be in a lose-lose situation. Fight early to become part of the sequencing, essentially defending the US by keeping Russia and China away from its borders, giving America the time to create its big heroes moment, or leave the States to its own devices potentially seeing it lose the war and then face the consequences of a world in which it needs to be part of the Russian-Chinese alliance or become its next target. And of course, there is the wildcard strategy, hope that Russia and China fall out. Though the two countries have a loose alliance, at least financially, and may be working together militarily, both Russia and China have a reason to mistrust each other. For instance, China will still remember the unequal Treaty of Aigun and Treaty of Peking that it signed with Russia in the mid-19th century. Those treaties saw China sacrifice over 620,000 square miles of its territory to appease the Russian Empire. And if we know anything about China, it doesn't forget about its past. Even into the 20th century, the two countries were involved in border conflicts, with the Sino-Soviet border conflicts in the late 1960s killing 72 Chinese soldiers. Those tensions lasted into the 80s, with China and Russia only coming together in the more recent years to follow their joint anti-West agenda together. Perhaps the US could take advantage of this. Clever use of diplomats dripping poison into the ears of the right Chinese officials could sow seeds of discontent into the Chinese-Russian alliance. After all, the US could say Russia has suppressed Chinese ambition in the past and has actively fought against it. What if Putin turned his attention to you after you beat us? And by the way, don't forget that America sent aid to China during World War II and essentially ended the Japanese threat against the country. Whether that tactic could work or whether Xi's ambitions for a stronger China would override past tensions is a difficult question to answer. But it may be a final small tactic the US could deploy to weaken an alliance between the two countries that would immediately put it on the defensive and may have the power to beat America into submission. It's a hypothetical situation that may never come to be. Still, it's interesting to think about what America would do if it faced a joint effort by Russia and China to invade the United States, which is why we're turning the question over to you. How do you think the United States would react to the threat of this invasion? Do you think it's already preparing to fight on its own soil? Or do you believe its global cooperation strategy, combined with its nuclear deterrent, could help it get ahead of the problem? Does the invasion end in the pressing of a big red button that devastates the entire world? Tell us what you think below, and thanks for watching. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.